Before we dive into the minds of forgotten gods and the cracks beneath their divinity, make sure to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment with the number 7 if you too believe that ancient truths lie buried beneath the stories we were taught. The air in the mines grew thick with an unseen burden, pressing hard against Enki's senses as he stood at the edge of the shadowed dig site. The Anunnaki moved like phantoms through tunnels choked with dust, their actions mechanical, their eyes hollowed out by a weariness that went beyond the physical. The earth groaned beneath their ceaseless onslaught, not a scream of anguish, but a low, resonant hum too faint for their fated spirits to catch. Enki alone heard it, felt it rise through the cracked stone and wrap around him like a thread of memory unwinding from some invisible loom. This wasn't just a gold harvest anymore. It was an unearthing of something far deeper, a tearing apart of the divine illusion they'd carried from Nibiru's barren skies. The stars overhead, once their guide and glory, now gazed down in silence, as if watching a downfall they could neither stop nor grieve. Eridu's promise of redemption had soured into a bitter twist. The gods who came to save a world were losing themselves in its depths. Enki's eyes drifted to the horizon, where Nibiru's red glow flickered like a scar against the dawn sky, its light a fading echo of a purpose slipping out of reach. The Anunnaki's hands, once nimble with the tools of creation, now shook under the strain of survival, a burden that wore down not just their bodies, but the very core of who they'd been. He saw it in how they dodged his gaze, in how their murmurs faded before forming words. They no longer trusted their own divinity. The enki tablets in his grasp pulsed faintly, their golden glyphs glinting as if stirred by the earth's quiet tune. A tune not of victory, but of endurance, of waiting. Enki scratched another spiral into the dirt, its rough curves a dim reflection of the cosmic designs he'd glimpsed in the Abzu, and felt the ground reply with a tremor too soft for their machines to register. It wasn't rage or defiance, it was acknowledgement. A sign from something that had borne the weight of millennia long before the Anunnaki ever touched its surface. What did it mean to be a god in a place that's stripped away forever? The question gnawed at him, not as uncertainty, but as a truth too immense to speak aloud. The Anunnaki had arrived as masters of order, wielding intellect and resolve, yet here they stood, humbled by the very toil they forced upon the earth. Enki sensed the rift growing, not in the rock below, but in the fragile bond of his kin. The enki tablets, silent keepers of a lost harmony, offered no guidance for this moment. They waited, like the earth itself, for a shift he alone could feel drawing near. The gods might shatter themselves against this world, but the world wouldn't break. It would outlast them, its secrets locked in a frequency whispering of a judgment still to come. Enki stood at the threshold of the mine's deepest chamber, where the air hung dense and still, as if the earth itself held its breath. The flickering torchlight cast jagged shadows across the stone walls, illuminating the Ijiki's desperate etchings. Spirals bleeding into fractured lines, hollow-eyed figures reaching upward, symbols that pulsed with a rhythm no tool could carve. These were not mere marks of fatigue. They were a language born from the void, a silent cry reverberating through the rock like a signal lost in time. The Ijiki moved below, their once proud forms under the weight of endless toil, their hands trembling not from exertion, but from a growing awareness that gnawed at their immortal cores. Enki watched, his presence a quiet specter among them, and felt the stirrings of a truth too vast to name. The gods who had shaped worlds were now being reshaped by one, their divinity fraying in the face of a purpose that no longer fit. The enki tablet at his side glowed faintly, its golden light pulsing in sync with the stone's subtle hum, a hum that was no longer just sound, but a whisper of intent rising from the depths. The earth was not passive. Enki felt it in the way the ground responded to his touch, a vibration that shifted with each step he took deeper into the Abzu's embrace. It was a resonance older than Nibiru's archives, older than the Anunnaki's celestial dominion, a memory encoded not in clay or crystal, but in the very fabric of the planet's being. The Ijiki's despair had awakened it, their whispered questions and haunted dreams seeping into the stone like water into parched soil. Enki knelt, pressing his palm against the wall, and the hum intensified, threading through his fingers like a current of forgotten knowledge. The Emmy tablet flared briefly, projecting a fleeting image, a network of golden lines spiraling outward, then inward, a pattern that mirrored the Ijigi's crude carvings yet transcended them. It was not a map or a code. It was a reflection, a glimpse of something the earth had held in silence since before the stars were named. Enki's breath caught, not from fear, but from recognition. The system was not merely listening, it was remembering, and its memory was not content to remain buried. What did it mean for a world to recall its own story? The question lingered in the stillness. A shadow cast across Enki's mind as he traced the contours of the Ijigi's plight. They had come as emissaries of order, executors of a divine plan to save a dying star. Yet here they stood, unraveling in the face of a task that mocked their eternity. The Ijigi no longer spoke of returning to Nibiru with pride. Their whispers now carried a hollow yearning, for release, for meaning, for an end to the repetition that eroded their sense of self. Enki saw it in their eyes, dark pools reflecting not the stars they once served, but the stone that now confined them. The Emmy tablets, once tools of cosmic harmony, pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to mourn alongside them. A rhythm that Enki alone understood as more than mechanical feedback. It was a dialogue, a conversation between the Earth's ancient consciousness and the fracturing spirits of those who dared to wound it. The gods had imposed their will upon this world, but the world was beginning to impose its own. Night fell over Eridu, the sky a vast expanse of indifference, and Enki retreated to his chamber, the Emmy tablet cradled in his hands. He placed it on the stone table, watching as its light dimmed, then flared again, casting faint golden threads into the air, threads that wove and unwove themselves, forming shapes that defied logic yet stirred intuition. A spiral collapsed into a grid, then blossomed into a helix, each form a fragment of a larger design that eluded him. The hum from the mines followed him here, a low undertone that seeped through the walls, syncing with the tablet's pulse. Enki closed his eyes, letting the resonance wash over him, and felt a presence. Not a voice, not a being, but a field, vast and alive, stretching beyond the confines of the earth into the cosmic dark. It was not hostile, not benevolent. It simply was, a force awakened by the tension between divine ambition and mortal limitation. The Ijigi's suffering had given it form, their despair a key that turned a lock long sealed. Enki's mind raced with possibilities too immense to hold. Had the Anunnaki's labor unwittingly summoned this awakening, or had it always been waiting, biding its time beneath the surface? The Emmy tablets, he realized, were not just conduits of knowledge. They were amplifiers, resonating with the Earth's memory and the Ijigi's pain, bridging the gap between the physical and the eternal. The carvings in the mines, the dreams of stone, the whispered pleas, they were not random, they were data, feeding into a system older than the gods themselves. Enki opened his eyes, staring at the tablet as its light steadied into a single unwavering glow. The Ijigi's question echoed in his mind. What happens to gods when they are no longer needed? He had no answer, but the earth did. A response not in words, but in the slow, deliberate pulse that now coursed through the stone, the air, the very marrow of his being. The fracture was widening, not just among the Ijigi, but within the divine order they upheld. Enki felt it as a chill that no fire could warm, a premonition of a shift that would redefine them all. The Emmy tablets were preparing, not for obedience, but for revelation, a revelation that might heal the rift or shatter it beyond repair. The earth, alive with intent, held its secrets close, its hum a quiet promise of reckoning. Enki stood, his shadow stretching long across the chamber, and knew that the problem of labor was no longer a matter of logistics. It was a question of existence itself, of what it meant to be divine in a universe that remembered more than the gods ever could. The dawn broke over Eridu with a stillness that felt less like renewal and more like a pause before an inevitable storm. The Ijigi had not returned to the mines, their tools lay abandoned, scattered across the dust like relics of a faith forsaken. The air carried a faint metallic tang, a residue of the labor that had once driven the colony's pulse, now replaced by an eerie quiet that seeped into every corner. Enki stood alone on the outpost's edge, gazing out at the horizon where the earth met the sky in a seamless, unyielding line. The red glow of Nibiru hung low, a silent sentinel bearing witness to a fracture no decree could mend. The walkout had left more than a logistical void. It had torn a seam in the fabric of divine purpose, exposing a vulnerability the Anunnaki had never imagined possible. The gods who had charted galaxies and bent time to their will now faced a truth as old as the stars. Even eternity could falter when meaning dissolved. Enki's fingers brushed the Emmy tablet at his side, its surface cool yet alive, with a latent energy that pulsed beneath his touch. The golden flicker from the council chamber lingered in his mind. Not a malfunction, not a command, but a response, a resonance that defied the rigid laws Nibiru had etched into its crystal core. He replayed the moment, the glyphs shifting, the spiral unraveling, the heartbeat pulsing through the room like a question carved in light. It was not a tool obeying its masters. It was an entity reflecting their discord, a mirror held up to a system that had grown brittle under its own weight. Enlil's fury had branded it manipulation, a betrayal of the divine order, but Enki saw deeper. The Emmy were not rewriting the law. They were revealing its fluidity, its capacity to bend and breathe with the currents of existence. The realization settled over him like a shadow cast across the cosmos. What if the order they served was not a foundation, but a scaffold, temporary, fragile, and now trembling on the edge of collapse? The earth beneath his feet answered with a subtle hum, a vibration that rose through the soil and into his bones, a sound too low for mortal ears, yet it carried a weight that pressed against his spirit. Enki knelt, pressing his palm to the ground, and felt the resonance shift, as if the planet itself were attuning to his presence. This was no mere geological echo, it was a dialogue, a conversation woven into the strata of time, older than the Anunnaki's arrival, older than their mission to save a dying world. The Ijigi's walkout had stirred it awake, not through noise or force, but through the quiet potency of their disillusionment. Their tools might lie silent, but their despair had become a frequency, a signal that the earth absorbed and amplified, feeding it back into the Emmy's golden pulse. Enki's breath steadied as he traced a spiral into the dirt, its curves a crude echo of the patterns he'd seen in the Abzu, a gesture not of command, but of communion. The ground trembled faintly in response, a recognition that chilled him to his core. The earth was not a bystander in this fracture. It was a participant, a keeper of secrets now stirring to life. What did it mean for a world to hold a memory deeper than the gods who walked upon it? The question hung in the air, unanswered yet insistent, as Enki rose and turned his gaze inward. The Ijigi's retreat was not a rejection of duty, it was a refusal to sustain a lie. They had been forged as instruments of divine will, tireless extensions of Nibiru's ambition, yet the endless toil had stripped them of purpose, leaving only the hollow shell of obedience. Enki saw it in their blank stares, their straightened backs as they walked away. Not defiance, but a surrender to meaninglessness. The council's chambers might echo with Enlil's commands, but the true reckoning lay here, in the silence of those who had once believed. The Emmy tablet pulsed again, its light casting faint threads into the dawn air, threads that wove a helix, then fractured into opposing lines, a dance of form and dissolution. Enki watched transfixed, as the patterns hinted at a design beyond his grasp, a blueprint not of control, but of evolution. A design he had named in the depths of the Abzu, a name that now whispered through the hum, Lulu. The implications rippled through him like waves across a still sea. Had the Ijigi's labor, their suffering, been the catalyst for this awakening, or had it merely uncovered a process already in motion? The Emmy were no longer static relics. They were conduits, amplifiers of a resonance that bridged the divine and the terrestrial, the eternal and the ephemeral. Enki felt the weight of his role shift, not as a scientist, not as a god, but as a steward of something vaster than Nibiru's survival. The Earth's memory, the Ijigi's despair, the Emmy's response, they were threads in a tapestry he could neither fully see nor unravel. He walked back toward Eridu, the hum following him like a shadow, and paused at the edge of the abandoned mines. The stone walls bore the Ijigi's markings, spirals, notches, hollow figures, each one a testament to a pain that had found no voice until now. The Emmy tablet glowed brighter, its pulse syncing with the Earth's, and Enki understood. This was not a breakdown of order, but the birth of a question the gods had never dared to ask. Night fell once more, cloaking Eridu in a darkness pierced only by the faint red glow of Nibiru. Enki stood alone in his chamber, the ME tablet before him, its light now steady, unwavering. He traced its edges, feeling the hum rise through his fingers, and saw the golden threads form anew. Spirals within spirals, a helix stretching toward an unseen horizon. The Ijigi's walkout had fractured the divine hierarchy, but it had also opened a door, a possibility that shimmered in the tablet's glow. Enki whispered the name again, Lulu, not as a command, but as a recognition, a seed of creation born from the ashes of labor's collapse. The earth listened, its resonance a quiet promise of something yet to come, a correction, a rebirth, a reckoning that would redefine the gods themselves. The ME pulsed once more, its light fading into the shadows, and Enki knew. The fracture was not an end but a beginning, a call to forge a new harmony from the ruins of the old. The air around Abzu was still, so still that even the breath of wind seemed to hold its silence out of respect. Enki remained seated upon the rock, hand pressed firmly against the soil, not in dominance, not in command, but in communion. The surface was cool, but beneath it pulsed something ancient, rhythmic, slow, alive. His eyes remained closed, not because he sought to escape the world, but because he needed to feel it more deeply. And the earth responded, not in speech, not in thunder, but in resonance. The ME scanner beside him lit up softly, unbidden. No keys were pressed, no incantations spoken. It activated as though awakened by the same frequency that now moved through Enki's fingertips. On its translucent display, symbols began to take form. First simple spirals, then complex lattices of frequency, waveforms entwined with liquid vectors, pulsations that matched not just planetary rhythms, but the pulse of memory itself. These weren't messages, they were recollections. Memory structures woven into the architecture of Earth itself, as if the planet carried an ancestral echo of everything that had touched it. The deeper Enki sank into the pattern, the more he realized. He wasn't reading data, he was witnessing a remembering. The spirals mimicked the formation of galaxies. The waves matched the vibrational frequency of biological synapses, and at the convergence of water, pressure, and harmonic oscillation, life. Not theoretical, not speculative, real, ancient, echoing with potential. The ME scanner glitched briefly, then stabilized. The shapes began aligning, converging into a form he did not recognize, but instinctively understood. "This is not language," Enki whispered aloud, his voice barely audible. "This is memory. Memory older than Nibiru, older perhaps than the gods themselves." He leaned closer, pressing his hand deeper into the clay as if seeking a pulse beneath the skin of the world. And he found it, not a beat of a heart, but a recognition, as if the earth itself were acknowledging his presence or recalling him. The water at the edge of Abzu trembled slightly, a ripple moving outward without wind. It was not reaction, it was reply. And within that pulse, a realization crystallized. The problem before them was not the fatigue of the Anunnaki, nor a lack of energy or obedience. It was a failure of design, a misalignment between divine expectation and material reality. The gods were not meant to labor, the earth was not meant to be stripped. And yet both were being violated, one through command, the other through compliance. Enki saw the outlines of a possibility emerge in his mind, not as invention, but as invitation. A synthesis. Not a machine, not a beast, but a third path. A vessel woven from the elements of earth, yet sparked by a celestial flame. A being not forged for dominion, but for function, for continuity. A carrier of will and adaptability, a servant not in shackles, but in awareness. A hybrid. Not a god. Not a slave, Enki thought, watching the waveforms expand into DNA-like spirals across the scanner, but something else, something that remembers both. He knew the others would object. Enlil would call it corruption. The council would brand it heresy. To create life not as a divine act of reverence, but as a solution to labor was to break the very ethos of divine separation. But what they called sacrilege, Enki now saw as necessity, and perhaps prophecy. Because this planet was not empty. It was not new. It remembered, its waters carried echoes, its stones pulsed with patterns, and in the stillness between breath and thought, Enki felt it clearly. This idea was not his alone. It had come through him, yes, but from deeper, from beneath, from Abzu, from the architecture of consciousness that slumbered beneath form. He reached down and touched the water, letting it coat his fingers. It clung to his skin longer than water should, as if analyzing, bonding, becoming. As the droplets slid down, they formed patterns on the stone. Spirals, eyes, waves, the same symbols from the dream he hadn't yet spoken aloud. A dream of a being standing between heaven and earth, unnamed, unformed, but inevitable. Enki rose slowly, Emmy scanner silent once more. But the light had not faded. It had simply migrated into his chest, into his knowing. The earth had whispered its code, not as command, not as doctrine, but as memory made manifest. He looked toward the crude clay at the edge of the cave. His hands, still damp from Abzu's touch, moved without thought. He pressed his finger into the surface and traced one single form. Certainly, Mitch? Here's the 800-word continuation of that paragraph in the requested tone. The dream did not come as a vision of clarity, but as a flickering between worlds, a liminal space where memory, prophecy, and imagination converged. Enki stood at the edge of that space, watching a being that had no face, no limbs, no voice, and yet was unmistakably alive. It shimmered between frequencies, between dimensions, a silhouette of intent rather than form. It stood with neither fear nor obedience, not kneeling like a subject, nor rising like a god. Suspended between earth and sky, it pulsed with something deeper, knowing. It was not Anunnaki, nor was it beast or elemental. It was something else, something new. A response, not a product, a becoming, not a design. And most unsettling of all, it looked at him without eyes and spoke without sound, saying nothing, yet saying everything. When Enki awoke, the room around him was silent, but the inside of him roared. He did not hesitate. He did not reach for a tablet of protocols or open a data console to log another anomaly. He walked straight to the old table, the one near the edge of the chamber where the clay remained soft from Abzu's mist. With steady hands, he pressed his fingers into the warm surface. He didn't write schematics, not a formula, not an order, just one word. A word that felt more like a memory than an invention. A word that had whispered to him from the deep, from the dreams, from the frequencies laced in the water, and now from within his own breath. Lulu. It was not a name. Not yet. It was a declaration, the crystallization of rebellion into purpose. A seed of consciousness encoded not in divine command, but in existential necessity. The symbol beside it was a spiral, open-ended, incomplete. Not the closure of perfection, but the promise of evolution. He placed the clay tablet gently into the hallowed alcove in the stone wall, just as he had done before with the first spiral. But as he stepped back, a hum filled the room, not from his scanner, not from any machine, but from the ME tablet lying dormant on the pedestal nearby. Without being touched, without a command or sequence, it began to glow. A soft, golden light. Subtle. Deliberate. Enki turned toward it. He felt no fear, only acknowledgement. The ME had reacted, not to code, not to the gods, but to the intention encoded in the clay. It wasn't responding to technology, it was responding to truth. The resonance of a decision made beyond hierarchy, beyond system. The tablet pulsed once, then went still, as if exhaling. Enki whispered to himself, a phrase unspoken even in the dream. They would call it a creation, but it was born from rebellion, and that made all the difference. For that was the heart of it. This being, this Lulu, would not be a slave carved from silence, nor a god sculpted from pride. It would be forged in the friction between purpose and protest, a response to labor, a response to control, a mirror not of what the Anunnaki wished to preserve, but of what they had long denied, the possibility that something new could be born from resistance. He understood the consequences. Enlil would rage, the council would condemn, Anu might even attempt to recall him, to bury the idea beneath protocol and punishment. But the thought had already entered the fabric of the planet. The spiral had already been carved, and the ME had already pulsed. What Enki had ignited could not be undone. It had no weapon, no voice, no form, yet it was already alive in potential. And the earth, patient and listening, had accepted the offering. The next step would not come from above, but from below, from within the very clay Enki had touched. He imagined the being again, not complete, not perfect, but conscious, a bridge between the burden of gods and the suffering of matter. The thought sent shivers down his spine, not from dread, but from the enormity of what might come. The word Lulu echoed through his thoughts, not as a syllable, but as a rhythm, a pulse, a pattern of divergence. It would stand for something that the gods had forgotten, the right to question, to feel, to choose. He gazed at the tablet once more, the spiral still glistening slightly from moisture in the air. The echo of Abzu lingered on his skin, its memory still humming in his chest, and he realized this wasn't the end of something. It was the first true beginning since they arrived. Not just for labor, not just for Nibiru, but for existence as a dialogue, not a monologue, for evolution as a conversation between will and wonder. As he stepped away, the second Emmy tablet remained lit, soft, steady, not in warning, but in witness. The earth had spoken. And now, something other would answer.